Hey everybody, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the Giant Diaspora. Now, for those of you who have never heard of this concept of the Giant Diaspora, this is the concept that the tribes of giants that were living in Canaan at the time of the Israelite invasion were eventually driven out by the invading Israelites, and over the century they were dispersed all over the world, hence the term diaspora, that they fled from Israel due to the successful invasions of the Israelites, and they went to all corners of the world, to all of the continents of the world, and this is why we see evidence for giants all over the world. So we're going to be breaking this down today. We're going to be walking through the timeline of this process that took centuries to unfold over the course of ancient history. If you haven't been grounded in the concept of the biblical giants or giants as a whole, you may want to go back and watch some of my videos, such as my introduction to giants video that I've made, or my video Giants in the Bible, just to lay some of that groundwork for what we're going to be talking about today, because there's going to be assumption that at the very least you have a basic understanding of the concept that there are, number one, giants in the Bible, and then number two, that there were giants living in Canaan when Joshua and the Israelites invaded. And that's essentially where we're going to pick up this narrative today. Now, as we know, in Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 4, we read that there were giants living in the days before the flood of Noah and also after that. So the fallen angels came down and they mated with human women, and therefore the pre-flood world was corrupted by this race of giants. And then we also see that they appear in the post-flood context, and this is essentially where we're going to be picking up our narrative today, because in the post-flood context, the place where they were dwelling in mass was in the land of Canaan. And the many Canaanite nations were, it's not that necessarily every one of the peoples living in Canaan was a giant, but that giant tribes were extremely prominent amongst the Canaanite nations. And this is part of the reason why God told the Israelites to be ruthless during their invasion of Canaan, because of this same genetic corruption that had caused so much trouble in the pre-flood world. God wanted that corruption that was such a threat and menace to humanity to be wiped out. So therefore, he ordered Joshua and the Israelites to go into Canaan and to not spare anybody, man, woman, and child. And they were ordered to be very ruthless as they took the land of Canaan. And we know from the biblical testimony that Joshua was the leader of the invasion of Canaan, and historical dates for that date that are somewhere between 1400 and 1200 BC. And as we read the narrative of Scripture, we know that although the Israelites were successful to a large extent in their conquest of Canaan, they, during Joshua's lifetime, did not complete the conquest as they were ordered to. This is a very prominent part of the biblical text, and this will lead to trouble for the Israelites for much of their history. And we know that these Canaanite nations such as the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Philistines, these nations were nations of giants. That these Rephaim, these descendants from the Nephilim of the pre-flood context, were giants that were living in the land of Canaan. And to generally summarize the book of Judges, we see that these very nations would torment the Israelites who had been disobedient to God, and God would raise up leaders. He would raise up these judges to deliver the Israelites from the torments of their enemies and their oppressors. And this period of instability and relative chaos went on for centuries until we finally come to the time of first King Saul, but then really it's under the reign of King David where we really see that process of driving the giants out of Canaan completed. And even though there's debate about the exact dates of King David's life, he's usually believed to have lived around 1000 BC. So in the 11th and the 10th century BCs, around the turn of those centuries, is when we come to the point where King David, being a man of war, we know that he killed Goliath in the famous showdown between David and Goliath, and that he also went after Goliath's brothers, because Goliath had a number of brothers who were also giants, and they were prominent amongst the Philistines. Goliath was a Philistine, Goliath of Gath, and David, being a man of war throughout his life after becoming king, he really completed that process of driving the giants out of Israel. And this really brings us to this concept of a giant diaspora. And we see that they go to literally places all over the world. And as we're going to talk about the giant diaspora today, and we're going to break it down, we're going to say there's essentially three main routes that the giants took. They went west into the Mediterranean Sea and even perhaps farther across the Atlantic Ocean. And then the second route is north by northwest into Europe. And then the third route is east by southwest east across the Indian Ocean and towards the Pacific and the many islands that are in the Pacific Ocean. And as we're going to break down these routes 1, 2, and 3, we're going to see that there are evidence for giants in these countries all over the world. And so this is really a fascinating concept. And what's really cool about this concept of the giant diaspora is when you break it down chronologically, because we're saying that these migrations happened over a period of many centuries, it really starts to really paint a strong picture that helps us to really understand ancient history in a way that we can if we're simply going off of the materialistic, secular, Darwinian view of history that really has covered up these concepts such as the giant. So that's what we're going to be breaking down for the rest of this video. The first route of the giant diaspora is west into the Mediterranean Sea. And we see evidence that the giants did in fact enter into the Mediterranean Sea. And we see evidence of this in various islands in the Pacific, such as Crete, Malta, and Sardinia. And this is no surprise to us because when we look at the history of the ancient world, the greatest seafarers of the ancient world who established colonies all across the Mediterranean were the Phoenicians. And the Phoenicians, that region of Phoenicia was in modern-day Lebanon. So once again, it is in that region of Canaan. And these people were amongst the Canaanite peoples that we just mentioned. So this includes the giants. And we know that the Phoenicians established colonies such as Carthage in North Africa and modern-day Tunisia. And Carthage established other colonies across the Mediterranean in places such as the Iberian Peninsula, modern-day Spain. And this really is fascinating when we talk about some of these islands. We look at Crete, we look at Malta, we look at Sardinia, and especially Malta and Sardinia, we certainly see evidence in the Mediterranean world of giants. If you watch the True Legends documentaries that were put out by Steve Quayle and Timothy Alberino, in those documentaries, they visited both Malta and Sardinia. And in Malta, there is Cyclopean megalithic architecture, or other words, giant architecture on the island of Malta. And there's even a tunnel network of underground tunnels called the Hypogeum. And when you look at the architecture of the ancient world found on that island, it strongly suggests that there were in fact islands on that continent. And in their research, the research of Steve Quayle and Timothy Alberino on Sardinia, they interviewed individuals who have claimed very credibly to have found skeletons of giants, even though this has been covered up by institutions such as the Vatican, in the same way that institutions like the Smithsonian have covered up evidence for giants in North America. And this also makes sense from the perspective of when we look at the Greek culture, especially, that flourished in the Mediterranean. We see in their mythology and in their legends, we see strong evidence for giants. A classic example of this would be the writings of the writings of Homer. In Homer, in his book The Odyssey, we know that Odysseus, king of Ithaca, after trying to get home after the Trojan War, he ends up going astray because, as the story goes, Poseidon was angry with him and drove his ship off course. And him and his men, they go through their many adventures trying to get home. And we know that Odysseus encounters this famous monster called the Cyclops, which is essentially a one-eyed giant. Now, of course, we understand that there is debate of should we view Homer's writings as history, legend, or myth, and that discussion can be had. But needless to say, there are evidence for giants in the Greek writings, their views of mythology, legends, and even history for that matter. So when we look at the concepts such as the Cyclops, we are seeing things that could be reinforcing the truth that giants were existing in the Mediterranean Sea. And we know that Homer lived in the 8th century BC, so this would be this is a few hundred years after King David's life in 1000 BC. So chronologically, we're seeing that idea, that concept that they would have came west out of Canaan after David drove them out, and one of the places they would have went is west into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, the second route that we talked about is north by northwest into Europe, and eventually we find evidence for giants in places like Gaul, Britain, and in the Norse culture. Now, it's fascinating that when we fast forward in history to the time of Julius Caesar, and he launched his invasion of Gaul in around the years 58 BC to 50 BC. So this is many hundreds of years after the time of Homer. Now, in Gaul, Julius Caesar, and he wrote a history of his invasions of that region of the world. Gaul is in modern-day France. As he was fighting the Celtic peoples that lived in Gaul, he gave testimonies of these giant and ferocious men that he called berserkers that fought with animal-like tenacity, sometimes wearing wolf's heads above their heads, wearing various dyes, wolf skins, terrifying to the Roman legionaries. And these were described as giant men. And Julius Caesar talked about how these giants were fought by his own legionaries. Now, assuming that Julius Caesar isn't exaggerating tremendously and that he actually, in fact, did encounter giant men in his battles with the Gauls, this would support the idea that the migrations of the giants out of Canaan, out of the Holy Land, over the centuries moved north and northwest into Gaul. And another place we find evidence for them is in Britain, and there are a number of legends of giants in the British Isles. And this could also be reinforced by the fact that we see megalithic architecture, which is always connected to the giants. We see evidence of this in the British Isles. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous megaliths in the world, Stonehenge, is right there in southwestern Britain. And this, once again, reinforces the idea that the giants moved north by northwest, and from there it's very likely that they moved west to the Americas, and we'll pick up that concept here in a moment. And then in Europe, the third place after Gaul and Britain where we see evidence for giants would of course be in the Norse. And in the Norse myths and legends in Scandinavia, we certainly see much talk of giants, and we know famously that the Norse god Thor is described as fighting these frost giants. And it needs to be understood that some of the creatures that are described in Norse mythology were believed to be real by the peoples who lived in Scandinavia, such as giants or trolls or dwarves or whatever else. The Norse mythology is very rich, and there are a number of these creatures that they were believed by the Norse people to have lived in that part of the world. And even some cryptid researchers in Scandinavia today have made claims that those creatures do exist, but I digress. So we see evidence for giants in various parts of Europe historically, such as Gaul, Britain, or the Norse. And now this brings me to the Americas. Now, in North America, we certainly see abundant evidence for giants, and this is something that has been understood very prominently historically, and we know that there is abundant evidence for giants in North America, even though this has been covered up by institutions such as the Smithsonian. For example, there's a famous quote from Abraham Lincoln when he was said to be looking at the falls of Niagara Falls. He said, "When I look at the falls of Niagara, I am reminded of the giant mounds, the mounds that house the skeletons of giants of North America." And when you understand that quotation from Abraham Lincoln, he did believe that giants existed, and he knew that they dwelled in these mounds. And these mounds are found all across North America. Many of them have been destroyed, but in the 1800s and the 1900s, when these mounds were being excavated, there were many skeletons of giants being found, oftentimes 9 to 12 feet tall, sometimes larger, but oftentimes 9 to 12 feet tall. And this is abundant evidence that the giants lived in North America. Now, although it is possible that giants could have reached North America from the Pacific route, which I have not yet talked about, it is very, very likely that giants crossed from the Atlantic route to reach North America. Even though I do think it's possible that giants reached the Americas from both routes. But in New England, we see megalithic architecture. There is a site in New England called American Stonehenge, which is essentially Celtic in its culture, and you see there that the site is portraying worship to the Celtic god Bel, which is connected to the Canaanite god Baal. And this is a fascinating concept that has been researched by men such as Barry Fell in his views of alternative archaeology that has been suppressed by the mainstream. And when you look at sites such as that and other sites in North America, it seems very likely that the giants that were in the Celtic world of Gaul and Britain found their way across the Atlantic to North America. Now, when we come to South America, we also find abundant evidence for giants, and this has been richly attested historically, even though it's been covered up in our modern day. Now, Magellan left writings when he circumnavigated the world. He sailed south around South America, and the Strait of Magellan today is named after him, and he sailed around the continent of South America into the Pacific Ocean. And in his chronicles of sailing along the coast of South America, he gives very detailed accounts of encountering giants in his travels alongside the South American coast. Now, the conquistadors, when they invaded South America in places such as Peru, the chroniclers left rich histories of encountering the remains of giants. So we have accounts of both living and dead giants in these centuries, such as the 15th and the 16th centuries AD. And then, so this shows that the giants were present in both North America and South America. Now, this brings me to the final route, which would be the south by southeast route into across the Indian Ocean and into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, there is a lot of evidence to show that the giants made their way to places like Australia and Easter Island, some of the other Pacific islands, and perhaps this is the route of which they reached South America. Now, in Australia, there is, in fact, a rich history of giants in that place, and there are legends of giants amongst the Aborigine peoples who live in Australia, and that's fascinating. And in modern times, there is a man there called Rex Gilroy, who is the director of the Mount York Natural History Museum, and he came to believe that there was a race of giants that existed close to modern-day Bathurst, Australia. So it's very fascinating. He found giant footprints that supported his views and his theories, and that he postulated that it's very likely that the giants reached Australia. Now, another place that I just mentioned is Easter Island, and we have modern-day researchers really have no idea how the famous statues on Easter Island were built. This is one of the famous ancient sites of the world today. And when you look at those statues, it is very likely that they were built by a race of giants. That is one of the more credible theories that we actually have when we break it down and think about it. And that would suggest the idea that the giants made their way across the Pacific, and this once again could have been the route that they reached South America. Now, another fascinating idea is one of the things that you see historically amongst the tribes of the Pacific Islanders was cannibalism. And cannibalism was a practice that was common amongst the giants. And it's when in the age of discovery, when some of the great voyages of exploration were going on. For example, in the 18th century, when Captain Cook sailed amongst the Pacific Islands, he noticed that many of the islander tribes practiced this practice of cannibalism, and that this is a practice that was really prominent amongst the giants. Now, even if those tribes of islanders were not giants themselves, is it not possible that practice could have been introduced into that portion of the world due to the giant migrations of history? That's certainly possible. So when you look at all these things, you see that there is a very great amount of evidence to show that the giants went all across the world. They traveled all across the world, and you can see that this process happened over many centuries. And when you were able to kind of put it in a timeline, as it were, look at it chronologically and understand how those migrations dispersed more and more to the various continents of the world, you start to see some threads of ancient history, even coming up into more modern epochs of history, really start to come together and make sense. And that's why this concept of the giant diaspora is very important, not only for understanding biblical history, not only for understanding the giants, but for understanding history as a whole. And so that is why this is such an important concept of the giant diaspora. There is far more work in anthropology and archaeology that needs to be done on these topics, because the more we can understand the giant diaspora and the evidence for giants around the world, we're going to be able to understand our ancient history in a way that is far superior to the understanding we currently have at this day and age. And that's why the giant diaspora is a very important topic. So as I always say, guys, don't take my word for it. Do your own research, do your own thinking, come to your own conclusions. But I hope that you've been edified by this concept of the giant diaspora. All that being said, this is Joe Harper with Reformed Truther Ministries. God bless.
If you enjoyed this video, then check out our website at www.reformedtruther.com.